When he opened his eyes on the last morning, the sun was still shining. That was the first thing he checked. Its rays couldn't reach his window, which faced a narrow courtyard, ugly like a diseased tooth. However, the small square of sky above the courtyard was still blue, and the morning promised to be hot, but it seemed like normal heat. Just another hot day in an exceptionally sunny summer. In any case, the sun was still in its place and had not exploded yet. Checking the behavior of the sun had become second nature to everyone. No matter what they were doing, they would instinctively glance at the sky every so often to ensure that the glowing yellow ball was still in its rightful place in the skies. Almost everyone carried a soot-covered piece of glass, a piece of black photographic film, or a strip of magnetic tape from an old floppy disk. Cardboard, disposable glasses with shiny black lenses, usually sold during eclipses, were now as popular as hotcakes, along with welding goggles. A glance at the sun brought calm and the strength to survive another day in this country. This had been the case since the day the infants spoke. Newborns and toddlers. Some were only a few hours old, others a few months. Certainly not old enough to produce any coordinated sounds. But they spoke simultaneously. In hospitals, in strollers, and in cribs. With terrible, raspy voices coming from their limp, undeveloped larynxes and still-forming vocal cords. "We will take you away from here," the infants said to their stunned parents, grandmothers and aunts. "We are coming to give you a new world. Leave. The sun will explode." The last sentence caused the most trouble. The infants spoke very unclearly. Some heard, "Sun will explode," while others heard, "Someday we come," or something like that. Some insisted that there was nothing of the sort in the message at all. Pyotr Siedlarski sat on his bed for the last time in his life and looked at his hated dark room, which this morning looked even worse than usual. Every detail was in its place, like the work of a grotesque interior decorator who wanted to create a synthesis of Polish slum. He had duly included yellowish stains and mold on the ceiling, a cracked window glass, weeks of dust and greasy dirt on everything, peeling oil paint, and even a light bulb dangling from the ceiling on an ancient wire, along with piles of plates with dried food remnants. A condom hung from the government smoke detector, carefully stretched over the slots of the analyzer like an ugly, withered fruit. The apartment matched the building perfectly, and the building fit seamlessly into the surrounding streets. Perfect harmony. Reason number one: this apartment, this house, this city. Pyotr deliberately hadn't cleaned for 3 weeks. Since the day he made his decision. He didn't want to have any good memories. Not even of a room brought to relative neatness. Every morning, he opened his eyes in a disgusting, smelly hole and checked whether the sun was still shining normally or whether it had already swollen into a giant orange ball pushing a tsunami of hellish plasma towards Earth, which would incinerate everyone's eyes and boil the blood in their veins in a fraction of a second. He didn't want to ponder, to yearn, or to have doubts. He had made his decision. This was not his home. His home looked completely different, but it had been dealt with. The cadastral tax and the Act on Equalizing Opportunities and Preventing Social Inequalities took care of it. He was a man, divorced, with no family and, most importantly, no children. He was entitled to a studio apartment with a window facing the courtyard, with a greasy stain on the ceiling. On this last morning, he didn't need anything that was here. Only what you love, the infant said. Only what has sentimental value. Don't take money, don't take everyday objects or clothes. Just mementos. You can have everything else new. Whatever you need. A new life, a new earth, new things. Rightly so. He had been selecting these things for 3 weeks. He would hold them in his hands and try to recall memories that would be worthy of taking to the foreign, navy blue sky on the new earth. Virgin, untouched by human feet, fresh and fragrant as if just taken out of its packaging. He would turn them over in his hands and place them back on the floor. He really couldn't find anything that couldn't be replaced. What was he supposed to take? Besides pictures of people he once loved, each was now a memento of betrayal, disloyalty, indifference, or unexpected death. He took a pipe. He knew that earth plants were already growing there. They bloomed and spread abundantly under protective domes so as not to contaminate the local ecosystem. All the ones that might be needed and couldn't be replaced with local varieties, including tobacco, coca, hops, and peyote. They didn't care. They didn't understand human taboos and had no intention of getting involved. According to them, everyone should decide for themselves. Get sick. You'll heal. Poison yourself, drink yourself to death, or overdose. Whatever. That was another reason why he didn't hesitate. Reason number 2, Virginia tobacco and whiskey. Farewell, ruthless bans and healthy lifestyles. As soon as he leaves the drop-off container, before he would take a piss, before he will buy a rifle and head inland to seek his fortune, the sources of rivers, or to discover El Dorado, he will first and foremost take a big Havana cigar from the dispenser and walk through the town, contentedly puffing out great clouds of smoke. Farewell, alarmist doctors, hysteria, and lifestyles. Except that for now, his container of prescribed size, no longer than a meter, no higher or wider than 40 centimeters, in this case, an old military backpack with which he had once traveled the Andes, climbed Kirinyaga Falls, and chosen for his emigration, lay at his feet, almost empty and deflated like a dried fig. He sat over it, feeling as if his stomach were filled with molten lead. Rise fever. Travel fever. Combination of fear, hope, and a bottomless dread of the unknown. The normal anxiety over the consequences of final decisions. At least from England, he could return. At first, it seemed that he had landed, if not perfectly, then at least much better. The cities were prettier, the people friendlier, and the state, he thought, less predatory. The billions of senseless inconveniences from that country simply didn't exist there. England was welcoming. Then he got used to it. He stopped being enchanted and started to observe. He saw hateful graffiti on the pristine white walls, groups of increasingly strange and increasingly aggressive immigrants subject to special rights. He himself was an immigrant, but he had come as a guest and intended to become an Englishman. Some others behaved like occupiers. He began to notice prohibitions. Not immediately, as they were phrased more cleverly and gently than in that country. What in Poland was called a strict smoking ban, here was a consequence of numerous laws that made up the Fire Safety Act. It was about fire protection, formulated as if all of Britain were built from resinous sticks and tissue paper. Every apartment had a detector. The slightest wisp of smoke, even from incense or a blown-out candle, triggered an alarm. If that happened, it was cheaper to burn down your own house than to pay the fire brigade for an unnecessary visit. He had no objection to the cameras on the streets, until he realized one could be as well assaulted where the cameras couldn't see. And then he received a fine of £2,500. At first, he had no idea what it was about because the letter from the town hall was pretty enigmatic. He thought it was a mistake. It turned out that, thanks to the Civil Safety Act, the system didn't make mistakes. It was the day he met his postman on Pinewood while walking to work. The morning was beautiful, rows of very English, neat terraced houses made of brown brick stood around, and the postman smiled warmly. Everything looked like something out of a classy, classic novel. The postman, without any fuss, handed over Piotr's addressed parcels, greeted him warmly, and said goodbye. Siedlarski looked through the envelopes but only found ads, which he carefully discarded into a bin by the bus stop. "You should have returned home and thrown the letters into your own, paid-for bag, sir," the town hall explained. "The city bins are for small litter, not your private waste. Furthermore, you violated the waste segregation regulations." They knew this thanks to street cameras. They tracked him down in 4 days in a country where he had lived for barely 6 months and where there were no ID cards. Paddington Bear had suddenly turned into 1984. Then Skinhead stabbed someone in the park, and immediately any carrying of knives, even Swiss Army knives the size of a keychain, was banned. Britons, including the freshly minted Welshman Siedlarski, were given 2 weeks to hand over any potentially murderous metal objects to the police. And after that, any headgear that obscured the face was banned, including hats, hoods, and caps with visors. Balaclavas were prohibited, even when the frosts came. It was for the convenience of the cameras. Later, they passed the Health Act and banned the use of salt in restaurants, processing plants, and restricted its sale. Meat, processed foods, all fats, and even sweets were taxed. Drinks were labeled with warnings. Next came the Anti-Social Behavior Act. From then on, no new bans were needed. The court formulated them according to its own whims, tailor-made for every citizen who had transgressed in any way. Someone who exceeded the speed limit was banned from driving any car capable of exceeding 50 miles per hour. If caught in a Porsche, they got 3 years. It all started with some gang in a housing estate. The boys were causing trouble in shopping centers and wore yellow golf gloves as their mark. They were banned from wearing any gloves and from approaching shopping centers closer than 60 yards. Nice. From then on, anyone could be banned from doing anything. That's when he gave up and returned to Poland. It wasn't even about the prohibitions. He could have probably dealt with those. He simply couldn't live in a country where there was nothing wild. All of Britain seemed cleaned up, raked, fenced in, and had designated paths. No wilderness. No thick forests, jagged peaks, or remote places. He found a forest in Wales that looked like a city park. Asphalt paths, straight as an arrow, raked leaves, trash bins, and solar-powered lamps. He couldn't stand it. It was in his genes. The soul of a pioneer. His whole life, he had tried to find a virgin area and build something perfect from scratch. Now he was being forbidden from doing so. Everything he built was being taken away, and wire fences were being erected. He was being told that there were procedures that had to be followed. Once, people like him set out by sea for new lands. Now there was nowhere left to sail, but the Columbuses, Pizarros, and Livingstons were still being born. Wild, with the clear gaze of madmen fixed on the horizon, they flailed about for decades like a bat in a bedroom, crashing into walls and signs prohibiting them from doing things, only to end up in prison or a mental asylum.
He returned to the country just in time to see cameras being installed, and to hear that Poland cannot be the last country in Europe to implement the Anti-Social Behavior Act. Everyone had been carrying salt on them for half a year, buying it at markets from Russians. He packed his bowler hat, a black, classic bowler hat in a round box from Harrods. A bowler hat he had bought as a joke when he wanted to become English. Reason number 3. The ban on wearing a bowler hat. Farewell, green Isle stripped of pubs, pipes, whiskey, a glass of sherry, fireplaces, and bowler hats. Farewell, England no longer being England. Goodbye, dethroned crown. Farewell, only what you love. Mementos, the infants had said. It was around then that he realized there was no place for him on the entire planet. First, he used to say, "This country," then, "this continent." And after a trip to the other hemisphere, he stopped commenting on anything. He tried in the States, in Argentina, and Australia. It turned out that there were generally two types of places: civilized, boring, comfortable, and bristling with countless bans ensuring safety, or wild regions, full of unimaginable poverty and anarchy. The kingdom of the Kalashnikov, where tyrannical power was held by drugged-up teenage warlords. A lone white man without the right to bear arms had as much chance of survival there as a tear in a furnace. In some places, he suffocated under the weight of shiny, plush totalitarianism. In others, he might have found a place for himself if he had a brigade of mechanized infantry. And that's all he gained from emigration, dear John. Once, long ago, during the Great War, soldiers called such letters Dear Johns. "I got a Dear John," they would say. They were on the front lines, and their girlfriends, fiancés, and wives were at home. They sent letters starting with "My dearest darling, Johnny," or "Sweetie." And then one day, there was no more "Sweetie," just a formal "Dear John." Then it was clear there was no point in reading further. I've met someone. He's a pilot lawyer, responsible young man. I can't wait forever. This war will never end. I have to think about the children, and you can go die in the trenches in the Ardennes, up to your neck in mud. And may they shoot you in the ass. Bye. Kisses, sweetie. Piotr also got his Dear John in England. Without even a dear, just Piotr. He packed it now in his backpack, along with the memory of his home, which they had built in the distant Suwałki region. Far from the rat race, the welfare state, or social solidarity, depending on who was in power. A home of his own, like something out of a Christmas postcard. With his own artistic forge and a huge kitchen. It was supposed to have a smokehouse, a distillery, and a miniature brewery. Completely self-sufficient, like the first fortified homes built after the fall of the Roman Empire, a fortress fort too. It had been so close, Piotr, she had grew up. She was tired of fighting the whole world. She had understood that he would never grow up and would forever flee from the responsible role that life in society assigned him. The time of pioneers and blank spots on the map had passed. She had matured and needed someone responsible who would give her a sense of security. She wanted to raise her children with a sense of responsibility and respect for duty. He couldn't understand where she got that language from. Did they operate on her? Was someone dictating it to her? He packed his Dear John into the collection of things he loved, mementos, along with her picture and the key he had managed to craft in his forge before he had to sell everything to pay the tax. That's what the infants advised. Take what you love. Reason number 4, the Dear John. Farewell, Annette. Farewell, my suddenly grown-up black angel, seeking the state's sense of security. Farewell, my beauty, who has outgrown humanity. Reason number 5, his forge. Farewell, labor laws, mandatory contributions, equalizing taxes, and health and safety regulations. Farewell, bans on the production of dangerous tools. I will light my forge somewhere else. That's why, in truth, he didn't care whether the sun would explode or not. When they appeared, just a few days after the infants had spoken, he didn't even care whether they had come to conquer Earth or to turn humans into slaves. He watched it all from the sidelines, filled with fatalism. The discs glided silently and eerily through the blue spring sky. Huge, shiny like mercury lenses if viewed from a kilometer away, and black as a well into eternity if they flew over your head. They even had discs, the damned flying saucers. What hysteria it was. They flailed like a flock of chickens at the sight of a pterodactyl. Some fell into a stupor, others reverted to routine behaviors. Prayers, wailing, attempts to flee to the countryside, and hoarding flour under the bed. The knowledge of great-grandmothers still urged them to stock up on salt, sugar, matches, candles, and canned goods, but all of that was already on the index. You couldn't really stock up on steamed vegetables. Science fiction writers and ufologists suddenly found themselves elevated to the status of media darlings and visionaries. There was no point in inviting an astronomer to the studio, someone who had spent his whole life insisting that life beyond Earth was impossible, and that interstellar travel was complete nonsense. Not when discs fresh from interstellar travel were hovering above, apparently filled with life from beyond Earth, which had just casually commanded infants to speak. The hysteria lasted a week, a powerful, interstellar-scale hysteria. Science fiction writers babbled about galactic wars, while ufologists spoke of cosmic vibrations and the spirit of friendship among all beings. The worst part was that, in the end, everything turned out to be so banal. It conformed to all the most cliché expectations. Flying saucers, aliens with 2 legs, 2 arms, and a head. For years, scholars had explained in a condescending tone that, if there were any living beings in the cosmos, they certainly couldn't look like humans. And yet, they did, more or less, just like that. At least according to the reports of the few who had seen them. The aliens communicated through infants, and few could meet them in person. All the old, uncensored films were dug up. Day after day aired. War of the Worlds, Star Wars, Stargate, Independence Day, and even Plan 9 from outer space. Civilians volunteered, soldiers deserted. Then suddenly, a dead, terrifying silence fell. The cosmic wars disappeared from screens as if blown away. They were replaced by films portraying the aliens as benevolent, noble beings. Close Encounters, E.T. Sphere. That was when the media coined the term elves, slim, ethereal, older than humans, noble beings. Positive associations, something was happening. The silence lasted 4 days. SF writers stopped being invited to the studio. Their places were taken, as usual, by politicians. Piotr watched it indifferently as soon as he realized there wouldn't be any death rates. He felt disappointment. There's a deal, his cousin, known as Richie, told him. His cousin the politician, his cousin the big shot. Once, he had been a fat kid with glasses whom Piotr used to scare with spiders, push into nettles, and trick into drinking ink. And now they were sitting on the terrace of some palace built in Masuria, Richie nonchalantly smoking a cigar, a motorboat circling the lake with men in black armed to the teeth. The Antisocial Behavior Act is coming, and you've already got a record, as long as an elephant's trunk. You know how it is. People are stupid, so the system has to keep an eye on them. Sooner or later, you'll slip up, and that, in turn, could be used against me. Our option won't last long, and the rainbow commies will be back. For 4 years, but I'm an expert, and I don't want to be replaced. That's why I arranged this for you. I'm doing it for my mother. He placed an elegant, thin folder on the teak garden table. What's this? A ticket to space. Our friends are offering a new planet. For anyone interested, new Earth, colonization, that sort of thing. Don't thank me. I've heard, Piotr said. It's an evacuation. The sun's going to explode. Bullshit. That's nonsense. An urban legend. The elves didn't mention anything about the sun. We checked with the eggheads. The heat bulb is fine. Nothing's wrong with it, he leaned in. It's politics. They want to weaken us, the Earth, you understand. They'll divide us into smaller groups. We'll get busy with colonization, and for a few hundred years, we won't be a factor in politics. US, humans, Earth. Do you think there's no politics up there? If we discovered the technology ourselves, we'd start looking for our own colonies and could mess things up for them. But this way, they give us a reservation and peace. We have no choice. We have to agree. They chose us. They chose our country. Now we have to take advantage of it. All over Earth, people are already packing. Nutcases, antisocial types, sociopaths, people like you. And I want to make sure there's a spot for you. So, what do you say? Piotr took the envelope from the table and leaned in toward his cousin. The same eggheads insisted that flying saucers didn't exist, and that the speed of light was the ultimate limit. I'll go. Even if the sun wasn't going to explode, I'd still go. He turned around as he was leaving the terrace. A bodyguard, a 2-meter-tall gravedigger with a hearing aid, moved to meet him. Piotr saw his reflection in the sunglasses that looked like black TVS. Richie, what do they look like? Elms, like gummy bears, like what? You know, those transparent, gummy candies we ate as kids, all like little water creatures. Well, damn, like aliens. What else can I say? You'll see for yourself. The Blue Pass, the one thing that might actually be worth something. It wasn't needed to get to the airport or board the ship. They were taking everyone. They set evacuation dates, but sent them by email to anyone who wanted them. The point was to prevent crowds from camping at the airports. The Blue Pass was an invention of that country. It guaranteed immunity for the immigrant. He couldn't be arrested or detained. He had a departure date. He had the Blue Pass, so no one was allowed to stop him. Apparently, this was part of the deal. If someone really went overboard, like hitting a policeman, smoking a cigarette, wearing a hat, or crossing the street after 2 beers, they would lock him up. But then they would ceremoniously drive him to the designated airports. He was glad he had it, because the media's witch hunt against emigrants was beyond comprehension. They even calculated that every person leaving was robbing the state of an average of €500,000 that they would have paid into the social security system over the course of their life. The Democratic Equality Party called those leaving antisocial fascists who would kill each other with easily accessible weapons and die within a few years due to returning to an unhealthy lifestyle. They prophesied violence, inequality, wild capitalism, religious superstitions, savagery, racism, and sexual harassment. The National Christian Bloc compared the effects of emigration to genocide and national extermination. They appealed to patriotism and the fact that there would be no salvation under an alien sky. They declared emigration equivalent to excommunication and high treason. They predicted anarchy, prostitution, pornography, and wild capitalism. None of this mattered to him because he dreamed of that other world. As far as he could tell, all determined emigrants were dreaming the same thing. 4 months, he had been seeing forests teeming with green, soaring over mountains, admiring emerald seas, and empty, ready to be inhabited deserted cities, where the buildings, avenues, and sidewalks were covered with a shiny, transparent membrane, similar to plastic wrap. A new world in an untouched box. The cities were provisional but comfortable. When he woke up, he first checked if the sun was still shining, and then whether he still had his Blue Pass, his goodbye song, the farewell blues. He added various official documents, packed in the leather folder in which Richie had given him the passport, to his backpack. He pulled a mini disc out of the player's slot, where he had recorded 4 hours of commentary, news, intervention programs, and discussions. The tables in the studios were occupied by slippery, plastic types like Richie, parasites nurtured by democracy, the whole untouchable cast of polished half-gangsters. None of them had ever done anything useful, knew nothing about anything, and weren't affected by any of the burdens they generously imposed on others. They had money, instant access to protection and gun permits, drove at whatever speed they fancied, and ate, drank, and smoked whatever they liked. The only thing they had to watch out for was the paparazzi. No complicated procedure could touch them. They created the system, so the system obeyed them. They had their ordinances, immunities, and privileges. Goodbye, you bastards. If they tried to re-emerge there, on New Earth, they would find an angry mob and a dry branch with a noose hanging from it. And Siedlarski would be at the head of that mob, with a torch in his hand. Goodbye. One day, nostalgia would catch up with him. He knew he would eventually miss the familiar stones, the graves of his ancestors, the cliffs of Dover, the polished seaside, the Masurian lakes. Even, why not, 4G Want, Wall, and the Artus Court. Maybe even for Prague in the Czech Republic. He would surely one day miss that country. And when that time came, he would open his old backpack and take it all out. His remedies for nostalgia, carefully, one by one. Mementos. The things you love. Just as the toddlers had advised. He closed the backpack and put on his freshly bought clothes. Some people dressed in their best suits, as if for a coffin, while others dressed like they were going on vacation, sandals, shorts, Hawaiian shirts. They knew that on the other side, they would find those strange automated warehouses that gave out everything you could dream of for free. Economists were pulling their hair out, and politicians spent hours explaining that it was impossible. But he had seen them and knew how they would work. He had seen it in his dreams. Siedlarski put on heavy boots, canvas pants, and a sand-colored shirt. Strong, comfortable clothes that could last 4 months in the unexplored wilderness of New Earth, the place where he would go to seek gold, haul goods by truck, blaze trails, and build settlements. He didn't know yet what he would do. He could do anything. There, deep in the interior, the law would only extend as far as his right arm. When he thought about it, he felt as if he were returning home, as if his natural environment was waiting for him. On his last morning on Earth, he didn't eat breakfast. He was afraid to open the fridge. A week ago his electricity was cut off, and now some murky, foul-smelling liquid was seeping out from under the door. He didn't know what it was, and he didn't want to know. Besides, there was nothing of interest in the fridge anyway. He removed a wilted condom, vulcanized by the summer heat, from the smoke detector and lit a cigarette rolled with smuggled tobacco. Goodbye, my little nest. As he stepped out onto the stairs, the sirens were still silent. The state was beginning to fall apart. He left the door open. Most solitary emigrants did that. Goodbye. They wouldn't get his contributions, but at least they'd have plenty of vacant apartments to choose from. Unemployment would become a thing of the past, just like the crowds on buses. Unless the sun explodes after all. Goodbye, sun. His neighbor was standing downstairs in the doorway, hiding in its smelly shadow from the furious July heat, blocking the door with his bloated body, deliberately. Where are you headed, neighbor? Why ask? Well, it seems to me you're going to the station. No offense, neighbor, but supposedly because of the people like you, the money for benefits may run out. Siedlarski glanced at his watch and noted that he had 3.5 hours left, 3.5 hours on Earth. They said on TV, if there's no one left to work, there won't be any benefits. I'm an invalid, damn it. You, neighbor, you're all right. You even gave me money for wine. But you're not going, no offense, but everyone has responsibilities, right? And if everyone leaves, what'll happen then? Then you'll have to earn yourself, cripple, said Sidlarski, moving forward towards the swaying, bloated figure in the doorway, the striped undershirt stretching from the inside like a hairy beach ball. What, to me, like that? You fucking faggot, I'll kill you, roared the neighbor. The obligatory, traditional prelude to a loud, chaotic brawl in the doorway, a kind of foreplay. First of all, Sidlarski began, not stopping for a moment, you're in my way. Secondly, the neighbor never found out what the second point was. Sidlarski didn't know either. One of the unwritten rules of street fighting foreplay was to start the brawl after the dialogue ended. The scuffle begins when the concept runs out. It had been the same since the Paleolithic era, and it happens the same way among both orangutans and rooftop cats. That's why Sidlarski said secondly and, with his left hand, grabbed the neighbor's face as he was listening. The man instinctively raised his hands and immediately took a powerful kick to the groin. With a sturdy boot from the 5.11 brand, known for its clothing for mercenaries and security companies, the Kevlar-reinforced toe of the boot drove under the neighbor's belly and sank him for a fraction of a second, like into a sack of cod liver oil. Without much effect, the fat man just groaned and charged forward like an enraged bull. For one horrible second, Sidlarski thought it was over for him. But the nerve impulse in the neighbor's brain, which had apparently gotten stuck somewhere in traffic, eventually made its way through the rarely used neural networks, honking angrily at the alcohol-induced roadworks, and finally reached the pain center, just as the large fists were on their way. The neighbor suddenly stopped, as if he had hit an invisible wall, clutched his bloated stomach, and doubled over like a birthing seal. Sidlarski lowered his defensively raised hands and looked at the neighbor, who was now bowing to him. The fat man placed a hand on the cement floor, lifted himself slightly, and vomited on the stairs. Piotr picked up his backpack, walked around the fat man, and, just to be sure, kicked him again in the ribs. The man howled and fell heavily to the side, like a dying buffalo. "Goodbye, neighbor," Sidlarski said. "Give my regards to everyone like you. Farewell." On the street, he was still trembling with anger and tension, though he wasn't sure if it was caused by the fight or the departure. It was strange to walk along familiar streets, knowing it was the last time. Absolutely the last. This wasn't Australia. There, on the other side of the great void, he would look at the sun, searching for it among the constellations at night, and it would be the light from a time when people sat in caves. He wouldn't even know if it finally exploded. If it turned into a supernova, they would see it thousands of years from now. All his ancestors, Pizarro, Leif Erikson, or Vasco da Gama, could return from their new lands. Sidlarski was going one way. He wouldn't have anything to come back to anyway. The city didn't look like it had suffered a nuclear apocalypse, but there was a sense that something was off. You could see broken windows, looted and abandoned cars standing inside streets with their insides gutted, but there weren't too many of them. The city wasn't completely empty either. It was somewhat like dawn, or like on a holiday. Few pedestrians, and even the traffic jams seemed to have disappeared. Supposedly cases of abandoned infants were growing frequent. Some people had a hard time forgetting how their sweet little Annie, freshly brought home from the hospital, suddenly opened her eyes and started delivering interplanetary speeches in a harsh, alien voice. Some never broke out from trauma after that. Police officers patrolled in groups of 5, wearing helmets and with automatic weapons slung over their backs. Occasionally, a boxy armored car with white I-Perform markings painted on it would slip by, full of Swedes or Germans hiding from the heat behind locked hatches. There were more of them near the station. Armored cars, police officers melting from the heat in their black uniforms, and people like him, emerging from alleys and streets in a star-shaped march towards the station, carrying bags with souvenirs no larger than 40 centimeters. Suitcases, briefcases, bags, someone was even carrying a cardboard box. Piotr wondered what they might have in them: photos, trinkets. The intellectual achievements of humanity had been copied and were already in place, like they had been sucked up by a giant vacuum cleaner. Holy books and trash from bestseller lists, everything, poems and vulgarities. The Curran and the Rage and the Pride together, everything. No need to bring anything, just mementos. At the station, they were already visible. From far away, before he even reached the stairs leading to the platforms, he could hear the shouts of the crowd. Whenever a train to the airport departed, a crowd would gather at the station. Silent emigrants, descending between rows of police officers to the platforms, and the crowd of those who stayed. Sometimes they came to say goodbye, and sometimes to shout and throw things over the makeshift steel tube barriers. Here, for the first time, the emigrants visibly differed, with the blue pass dangling from their necks, which opened the access to the platform, and the bundle clutched to their bodies. Only on the train did they begin to talk. An old commuter train, covered in enormous graffiti like a rash, with mesh screens installed over the broken windows. Strangers who realized that soon they would lie down in elongated, sarcophagus-like containers and wake up on New Earth, next to the same people who were now riding this train, and who knows who else. This was another thing no one had expected. They got to be transported as it goes. No national or state relocations. Just billions of randomly mixed containers. Those who lay down together had a chance of ending up together in the new place, but there was no certainty. The containers were reloaded, transported by various ships, like containers of oranges. You could choose a double sarcophagus to travel with your child, and that was it. If someone had several children, one might be sent to the other side of the planet. For a moment it appeared to Sidlarski that searching for lost loved ones might be a good business opportunity there, even despite the global network, compared to which the Earth's internet was like a phone made with string and tin cans. Here, it was prophesied that the mixed colonists would immediately start fighting upon awakening. Arabs against Jews, whites against blacks, and so on. Sidlarski doubted it. Maybe later, once cliques and groups formed. But he suspected that the aggressive ones would try to dominate the rest, regardless of origin, skin color, or eye color. Outside the windows, an empty rural landscape slid by. Fields scorched by the heat, blue skies, and the furious, burning sun, the eye of our day. Goodbye, sun. The sun will explode. Someone handed him an open bottle. A sip of shared warm vodka had something of a communion about it. He swallowed it, breaking several regulations, and passed it on. The train door was open. Someone was sitting on the steps, shamelessly smoking a cigarette, with the abandoned fields sliding past over their head, and swaying fields of grain where no one worked. Stray cars sometimes stood by the road, sometimes in the fields. They were taken from the streets and driven until the free gasoline ran out. Then they were abandoned, and new ones were sought. He looked around the carriage, observing the seated passengers. Some were nervously cracking their knuckles and staring at the floor. Clouds of smoke from smuggled tobacco hung in the air, but no one protested. Someone was praying, someone else playing the blues on a harmonica, the kind that had been drumming in his head for a long time. A goodbye blues. Farewell song. He saw her when they were getting ready to disembark at the makeshift station, surrounded by barriers and I-Perform strikers enclosed by a fence and lined with concrete slabs. It was like a sudden flash, like a revelation, as if he had known her for a long time. She wasn't beautiful, not in that sense. But she was perfect. When Szydlarski saw her, he felt as if his heart had broken from admiration. There was something about her figure and facial features that fit his ideal of a woman like a key fits a lock. He knew he had frozen with his mouth half open, staring like a calf, but he couldn't help it. Someone jostled him, and the spell was broken. He moved down the narrow corridor of fences topped with razor wire, trying not to lose sight of her. The crowd pressed into the corridor and turned into a slowly moving queue, disappearing somewhere at the entrance to the airport building, over which loomed the enormous, flat mass of the ship. 3 more ships hovered silently and motionlessly in the sky, waiting for departure or loading. They were like floating islands of gleaming obsidian or enormous black lenses. A heavy, heat-trembling silence hung in the air. Where the alien ships appeared, the birds disappeared. No one had managed to remove the gulls, jackdaws, and jays from around the airport, but now they were all gone, every single one. Even the crickets and flies were silent. "I'll find you," he thought, looking at her slim back and the hair tied in a ponytail. They let in 10 people at a time, followed by a few minutes break. Minutes during which you had to strip naked and lie down in the sarcophagus, stowing your luggage and clothes in a special compartment. The container would close and lull you to sleep gently, like a great-grandmother's lullaby. When you opened your eyes, it was all over. A new world, new earth, a new sky, and a new, stable sun. Everything was automatic, no seat belts, no cups of juice or meals on trays, but also no thrombosis, nausea, or jet-lag inconveniences. The sarcophagus, a deep, death-like sleep of anabiosis, and then, welcome to New Earth. Beyond the fence, a high barrier of thin, welded rods, there were concrete barricades, then armored vehicles and I-4 patrols, then another concertina wire fence, like a stretched-out barbed DNA spiral, and the crowd, not even that big of a crowd. Those who wanted to say goodbye stood closer to the entrance, where they could at least reach through the wires. Here stood the psychos. Someone might have considered they hadn't lost anything on the other side of the universe and chose to stay. That Szydlarski could understand. Someone might not believe that the sun would explode, or that the velvet totalitarianism least offered the illusion of safety. Fine. But who would want to come here every day in the heat, shaking their fists, waving banners, cursing, shouting nonsense, and throwing stones? Who would want to jump on the roof of a minibus, waving a reproduction of a Black Madonna icon glued to cardboard with the caption, "Jesus stays on Earth"? Instead, he quite liked the banner, "In space. No one can hear you scream." Well, whatever. No one heard him on Earth either. The closer they got to the entrance, the more nervous people became. Every now and then, someone glanced at the sun, shielding their eyes, as if expecting it to suddenly spread across half the sky and incinerate everything before they could board. 10 people, and then 5 minutes of waiting. At least 5 minutes. Foreign soldiers stood in front of the port's doors, sweaty, with red faces, in uniforms with angular, bright green camouflage. They counted 10 people and let them in. A pause. There was no point in even trying to change anything, to bargain or chat with them. They didn't know the language. They were essentially incorruptible. Scandinavians. Szydlarski was fine with that. I-4 was all right. They didn't understand the banners or the shouts. If they had to push the crowd away from the barriers, one could chant Gestapo as much as your heart desired. They didn't know what it meant, and they didn't care. They cared about the heat, the barriers, and ensuring the safety of the emigrants. They guarded the airport. That's it. Professionals. He was curious where they came from, and managed to spot the blue and gold emblem with 3 crowns. Swedes. Another 10, separated by a pat on the shoulder, the hiss of the door. He spotted his girl. She had entered with the previous group. Nothing could be done. They still had a chance to land in the same place. He waited, and noticed that he, too, was looking at the sky. Not even because the sun might explode, but because this could be the last time. In just a moment, the sun he would see again would be a completely different star, shining on the other side of the universe. Cine cracked at that very moment. When Szydlarski ran into him unexpectedly in the city, his heart skipped a beat, because Cine should have already been on the other side of the cosmos, lounging on a virgin beach with a bottle of rum and a cigar. I couldn't do it, Cine confessed. It wasn't even about my folks or this country. I couldn't do it. It's too far. I realized that even the stars would be different. I can't. It's not normal. A man can't live outside his own planet. Forgive me, I can't. Since everything will stay here, every stone. The sight of a grown man crying in a suit and tie was terrifying, and Szydlarski couldn't get it out of his mind for a long time. But he wasn't going to turn back. They counted them off, his group. He saw the other man when he was patted on the shoulder as the 5th in line. That man looked terrible. In a uniform with Swedish angular camouflage, snotty, red-faced, he staggered out from somewhere in the arrivals hall and tried to grab a passing girl. She screamed and jumped back into the crowd. The Swede then grabbed Szydlarski by the shirt. Someone screamed, and there was a commotion. Stick, dom Luga, dom Dados, he slurred incoherently, shaking desperately, as if trying to hammer something into Pieter's head. A frothy trickle of saliva ran from the corner of his mouth. God, he's a madman, Szydlarski realized, grabbing the man by the wrist, but the soldier held on like a vice. Fly, dom Kamerot Dados, the Swede cried out desperately. His pupils were terrifyingly dilated, his eyes vacant, like a drug addict's. Szydlarski felt many hands grab him. One of the soldiers swung a rifle and struck that man in the side of the head with the butt. The lunatic disappeared into the crowd, as if sinking into it, swallowed up by the green-olive camouflage. In the midst of the throng, the nerve-wracking sound of a taser crackled, followed by a scream. Suddenly, the group of people flailing on the concrete erupted in a short, desperate cry, and everyone jumped back. The soldier managed to yank a pistol from someone's holster. The emigrants froze in terrified silence. The Swede sat for a moment with the gun in his hand, then shoved the barrel under his chin and pulled the trigger. The crack of the shot whipped the air like a whip. The soldier jerked in place, then collapsed limply like a sack, and half a second later, the shaken crowd was showered with blood and bits of brain, like undercooked scrambled eggs. Szydlarski stood there, paralyzed with horror, speechless. Oh God, he whispered, swallowing hard. He walked through the door, staring at the motionless body on the floor. One leg was still twitching slightly. He's lost it too, he thought. Enough, lunatics, he told himself as he stepped into the box. The sarcophagus emerged through a small door and opened up invitingly in front of him, slippery inside like a womb, covered in mucus and something resembling tissue. It smelled faintly of acetone. Goodbye, Szydlarski said, unbuttoning his shirt. Farewell, Earth.
Part 2. Guno. That morning, Ole went crazy. Without the slightest warning, from 0 to 100, which was the most terrifying part of it all. Sure, he bought illegal booze from the Poles, and Lieutenant Kirstin kept telling them it was poison that could even kill you. It contained impurities, fusel oils, and methanol, and was even more toxic than regular alcohol. Bullshit. If Ljungberg had gone blind, fine. If he had thrown up and had some stomach symptoms, you could believe it was because of the booze. But he just went insane. First, he disappeared from the cordon. Okay, sometimes happens. Everyone knew he liked to sneak off for a joint and hide somewhere. But he reappeared half an hour later looking like something out of a nightmare, drooling and babbling, and started attacking the immigrants, screaming and yanking them around like a gorilla. Gunnar jumped at him, blocked his arm, but then Ole turned around and let out a terrifying scream, one that no human throat could produce. It was part pig squeal, part scream, and it still gave him chills down his spine. He grabbed Gunnar by the jacket and flung him into the fence like a straw man. They took his legs out from under him. Carl jumped on Ljungberg's back, put a baton around his neck from behind, and bucked like a cowboy riding a bull, while two others tried to pull his arm to slap the handcuffs on. Kirsten jabbed a syringe into his thigh, but still, Ljungberg thrashed around like a bear, roaring wildly. It took a good few minutes before he finally softened and calmed down. Great day, no doubt. And on top of that, the inhuman, tropical heat was pouring from the sky, but at least the sun was still shining in its place. Maybe Ljungberg's brain overheated? Then came the endless hours, seeping through the heat like pus from a wound. The cordon, the chatter of walkie-talkies, and the never-ending procession of emigrants, the shouts of protesters and the procession of sad refugees with their luggage stretching to the horizon. Count 10 people, check if they have the required baggage, pass them through the scanner. Close the door, open it, and repeat. After a few hours, you turn into a machine. Just for more months. For months, and he'd be standing in that line himself. But before that, he'd meet that bitch Kirsten, Madam Lieutenant Kirsten, one-on-one. Somewhere in a dark alley. Preferably here. And they'd still blame it on the Poles. 10 people, baggage, door, scanner. For months, unless the sun explodes before then. When he saw her walking straight toward him, in tight jeans and carrying a bag, he was speechless. He had never seen a girl like her in his life. She was the kind he'd been looking for all his life. He knew she could be both a lover and a friend. Supportive and attractive at the same time. He knew everything about her in a split second. She fit him like two hands fit together. He felt his heart pounding. "I'm going to take a leak," he said to Kullstrom, who was standing next to him. He slipped into the departure hall and, without drawing anyone's attention, moved to the side where various technical rooms still existed from the time when this was just a regular airport. Here and in the areas where they were stationed, things looked normal. The rest of the airport had been overgrown by the constructions of the others. Half geometric and half insect-like, as if built by mechanical hornets. No one went in there. You could get lost. The shiny, acetone-smelling oval corridors branched out, forming a veritable labyrinth, with twisted, pulsating shapes protruding from the walls like petrified intestines. Apparently, the closer you got to the ship, the weirder it got. They said there was radiation there that could kill you on the spot. People sealed in sarcophagi were safe, but wandering through there could end badly. As a result, no one wanted to enter that part of the other's territory, which resembled a demented steel wasp's nest. No one except Gunnar. Gunnar wanted to see the alien at all costs, just once. That's why he broke the rules, orders, and common sense. 3 times. He took a flashlight and a ball of string with him, just like Theseus. He didn't venture far. He pushed his way through the twisted corridors as if wandering inside a block of cheese, got lost twice, and discovered that his phone had died and his quartz watch had stopped working, but he never once managed to see the alien. He didn't see anything alive at all, not even an ant. But he did find his way to the room where the sarcophagi appeared, from the side of the compartments, so the sarcophagi passed by him, and hidden in the darkness, he could see all the rooms without being seen himself. That's where he went now, not really knowing why. The idea occurred to him to mark her sarcophagus. The idea was foolish because the container, marked or not, would go its own way and land wherever it was destined to, and Gunnar would arrive 4 months later. To some place on that planet. A vast planet with more landmass than Earth. He knew this, and yet he went. If only to at least see her. She entered just when he was sure he was too late. He saw her step into the middle compartment and, as if spellbound, watched her undress. She took off her blouse, then sat down in the open shell of the sarcophagus to remove her tight pants and shoes. He watched as she stood up, slim, naked, and golden, as she stored her clothes and small refugee bag, then lay down on her back in the chamber, surrounded by heavy vapor swirling around her like swamp mist. The cover closed with a soft thud, and the sarcophagus began its journey. Gunnar took a marker from his pocket, and as the container passed him, he hastily scrawled, "Gunnar half skoy, I love you." He even managed to draw a heart around the inscription. The container disappeared into the darkness, and Gunnar followed it. The flashlight immediately began to glow yellow, as if the darkness of the corridors was draining its light, but he could still see something. He heard a mechanical, prolonged hiss ahead of him, followed by a thud as something heavy fell. He got stuck between some slippery, hard forms, like a tangle of snakes through which dim light shone. His belt caught on spikes that gleamed like diamonds. And then he stepped into a heap. There was a crunch under his feet, and when he looked down, he froze. He was standing ankle-deep in mementos. Glasses, lighters, photos, watches, and pearl necklaces. Around him stretched a vast circular room bathed in dim, bluish light. The room was filled with huge piles of trinkets, gutted suitcases, ripped bags, and discarded clothes. It looked like a storage room in a concentration camp, save for the extracted teeth. In the center was an open space illuminated by a beam of light, where empty sarcophagi stood in a row. He saw them pass by him on their return journey, and on one, he could still see the hastily scrawled marker inscription surrounded by a crooked heart. He heard a rumble, as if someone was rolling train cars, and from the darkness emerged rectangular shapes, like giant playing cards standing on edge. He approached as if in a dream. Mindlessly, completely submerged in bottomless stupefaction. He recognized her. The slim body was gone, leaving only the nervous tissue, a red network of nerves, embedded in a transparent slab, but so precise that it outlined every single, smallest fiber, perfectly tracing the entire now non-existent shape of the body, denser at the nipples, lips, and lower abdomen. It looked like a map of her body, yet so exact that her features remained the same. And the eyes. The eyes were still in place, in the ghostly face, woven from scarlet lace. Terrified, desperately pleading eyes. Eyes that begged. 10 slabs passed him, rolling vertically on rusty rollers, until they stopped in the center of the room, under the beam of light. Then, one by one, they shot upwards, straight into the glare. He didn't know what it was. Memory plates for some infernal computer? Spare parts? Or perhaps a neural variant of galley slaves? Somewhere behind him, there was a sound like the last remnants of water draining from a bathtub. Wet and gurgling. Gunnar turned sharply, trying to reach for his weapon, but his hands were paralyzed. He turned and, for the first time in his life, saw an alien, and cold, stony paralysis gripped his legs as well. The elf was very thin and very tall, over 3 meters in height, with a very elongated face and huge, moist eyes in which the ancient wisdom of the universe slumbered. The alien's body looked as if it were made of blue liquid, transparent, with soft lines, inside of which some complex organs flickered, glowing with luminescent colors like deep-sea creatures. Gunnar tried to scream, but only a rasp came out of his mouth. The elf moved gracefully, like seaweed at the bottom of a calm sea. With light, subtle movements, as if it were a being without bones, the lights flickering within it resembled a neon garden. The alien's eyes blazed green and gold, like the eyes of a moth, and suddenly Gunnar regained his ability to move. He jumped back and went crazy. Just like that, as if someone had snapped their fingers. The feeling was as if a giant soap bubble containing madness had burst in his head. He moved stiffly toward the exit, desperately trying to gather his thoughts and focus enough to warn the others. Words scattered like fish in an aquarium. He tried to say something, but couldn't remember a single word. What he needed to convey could only be expressed by screaming, so he screamed. He only remembered that he had to get outside. So he walked like a robot, while inside his brain, one by one, soap bubbles burst, extinguishing the last remnants of his thoughts. When he got outside, he already saw people as writhing shapes, which he couldn't associate with anything specific. For a moment, Gunnar's vision sharpened enough for him to recognize the figure of a tall man with a backpack on his shoulder in front of him. He grabbed the man by the collar, trying as carefully as possible to utter the last thought that remained to him: run. It's a lie. They're killing us. But he knew that only gibberish was coming out of his mouth.